G'day there, everyone. Welcome to this episode. And joining me today is Senior Product Manager at Microsoft, Mr. Mark Kashman. Welcome, Mark.
Hello, Daniel. Thank you for having me, and it's always nice to connect. I feel like, we're on different hemispheres, so you're upside down or I'm upside down, but something works, and it's really nice to connect with you.
Indeed, we are. Now, for the people that are watching and listening, and probably for the two people that don't know who you are and what you do, tell me a little bit about Mr. Mark Kashman.
Yeah, so I joined Microsoft a couple of years ago, a little bit more than a decade, and my roots are with the SharePoint product. So I honestly only started with SharePoint in the cloud in the early BPOS days. And I've gone through all the instances of what we call the cloud, Office 365, Microsoft 365, but whatever SharePoint's role is for content collaboration and our role in creating services for other products, I am one of the product managers that gets to say I'm a SharePoint product manager.
Very good. Now, recently, you are, well, can I call you Mr. Microsoft Lists? So you've been doing a lot of work with Microsoft Lists recently.
Yes, I probably should have included that in my intro, but on top of that sort of SharePoint platform background, we decided that collectively, we needed to up-level what we did with lists. And I got the tap on the shoulder, the question of would I like to be the Microsoft List product manager? And without a doubt, I said, absolutely, that sounds fantastic. So in addition to having used SharePoint lists for a long time, bringing to market Microsoft lists, all over the place, not just in SharePoint, within Microsoft 365, within Microsoft Teams, and everything new from a mobile client to just a better interface on the web. It's all goodness, and it's a really nice part of the portfolio that I manage as a product manager.
And so Microsoft Lists lists in general, I guess, have been around for a long time, and I guess they're kind of thought of as the building block of SharePoint in many ways. So tell me a little bit about, I guess, the evolution of lists, where they started, and the progression to where they are now.
Yeah, I think I can cheat a little bit and just kind of rely on a lot of stuff of how I hear Jeff in his original framing memo. I wasn't there that long ago, but when I think about how they built SharePoint, they really built it as a sites destination, a place where you can, put your portals and sites and have people go to, a place to put your documents and content so that if you wanted to reference them, collaboration, obviously productivity. And it just got to a point where they needed some element where they needed a database. And it wasn't something that needed to be as extreme as what SQL offered. It needed to be a little bit easier to use than something like Access, and something a little bit more integrated in the product than just storing an Excel document. And so they really relied on lists. And really, before they brought that to market, there was a notion of, and it should be a platform element and a self-serving, team element. So with that, there was this born of a birthing of lists that really is just that, rows and columns with a nice friendly user interface, friendlier than most at the time. And I still think now, kind of holding that true throughout the evolution of both itself and, seeing what's going on in the marketplace. But if you take that database element and just really at a lower level, make it super simple, super easy, that evolution brought to it that back end of really putting your data and information into a real database, but giving it the ease of use, ease of access, true collaboration, beautiful colors, and everything that used to be a lot of dev work or design work, which is still there to do it when you need it, but to really give the power to the people. That evolution of lists has really taken it to the nth degree now with Microsoft Lists, but the legacy plumbing that's been there from a really early phase and early planning of SharePoint has carried through. So there's a lot of deep level IT, deep level developer, and really great end user capabilities too.
Yeah, well, you touched on it there as well. It traditionally, I guess, has kind of been to customize lists or to get extend lists or the functionality previously. Traditionally, it's kind of been up to more of a developer type focused person to be able to create that type of functionality. Whereas now, what I'm seeing, and I'm sure what you're seeing, is that there's a lot of end users and power users now that can produce some amazing outcomes and solutions just by using the out of the box functionality that Microsoft Lists provide. And I guess, again, interested to hear your thoughts on this as well. But historically, that lists probably haven't been part of that collaboration story. I mean, collaborating on content or row items in a database or in a list probably hasn't been one of the major use cases. But what we're seeing now with lists in general is that the functionality and the features that are coming to lists really do now bring that Microsoft Lists into that collaboration story. And I talk a lot of more around, I guess, the commenting on individual list items. And one feature that's really really great for end users to make it really easy to collaborate on these is now at mentioning in the comments somebody else, and that automatically then shares that list item to an individual person. Which is something that has always been, I know previously working with lists a lot, has always been something that's been requested. So now, not having to go in and break inheritance and set security item level permissions, we can do that really, really easily as an end user.
Yeah, I mean, the history part of it, I think the way that I at least understand the way that it was built and the way that originally was used was I'm building a business solution, and I'm not just doing it by myself. I'm probably going to hire somebody or work with a number of different people who are going to help me design a nicer looking form, or help me going to structure the schema or how I'm going to track this information. And then there may be some components where I'm connecting to other services. And that's well and good. Those are still very valid scenarios. Lists play an important role in that. There's a continuum of, well, understand what are you trying to accomplish, and there may be one or multiple tools at play, being Power Apps or Power Automate to make some of those connections. But I think with lists, that notion of I can get started and accomplish a lot for some of my more simple information tracking needs. Like I might be at a conference and I just want to track a list of customers, what their questions were, and maybe a contact who can get back to them. Or something I use a ton about is I manage and orchestrate a lot of what our group does at different conferences. And what we do is usually similar. We have breakout sessions, workshops, a keynote, and maybe some other things like a booth. And all the while, it really equates to tracking speaker, abstracts, the level, date and time in the room. And those repeatable things we started to see as you don't need to build an app every time, just leverage a template or just start using the product to track it. And so on that continuum of Mark, who I mostly use lists a lot because I'm the product manager, but as a real user of the product, my needs are pretty simple. But when I work with people who are in our HR team, who are managing through a list onto a back-end system that I have no access to, but as an employee, when they ask me to do a certain number of things, some of that is interacting through a list that may then interact with a separate system through an API that I know nothing about, but it was configured and set up that way. And everything in between is really just giving the tools that people need. And we know that sits alongside working with email, working with documents, landing on sites, and other things like tasks and other notions that you might be using a number of different apps from the portfolio. But when it comes to tracking information with a little bit more structure, with configuration, a visual component, and then tools that if you want to up-level what that solution needs, you can do that. We think that's the sweet spot for lists, and the collaborative nature I think you hit on 100%. Last thing I would say is when you can mention somebody on a list item, it's like you're sharing just that discrete component. You referenced permissions, which I think is super important, but also the notion of I'm not going to send Daniel the list of 100 items and then tell him row 3. I'm going to just send him row 3. and
Yeah.
you and I
Yeah.
get less confused of what I'm asking, what you're going to contribute, and when it's done, that component is updated. And most likely, I know you may have permissions or not to the rest of the list, but I can control it, or if you share with me, you can control that.
Yeah, and even little things like notifications, and you talk about
Mhm.
tracking data and tracking information there, and again I go back to probably an end user needing to contact IT or a dev or something to
Mhm.
implement this. But now with the introduction of rules into lists, we can get easily notified of column changes or value changes or anything like that really easily now,
Mhm.
as opposed to having to, well, potentially fire up SharePoint Designer and get somebody to create a little workflow
Yep.
to manage that process. It's now pretty much done all inside the browser now.
Yeah, and I think rules are a great example. If you think about even the behind the scenes look at how the teams work together, you would think when we first started to roll out rules, the Power Automate team would say, "Whoa, that's our job."
Yeah.
But the reality is there are some things that are one, two, and you're done. It's two steps. It's two pieces of information and one action. Whereas Power Automate, where they really see, and really when you use it, you go in and you might add multiple steps with serial processing or state-based whatever. And there may be a notification involved, but there could also be a reach out to a system to get a component of some other line of business system, and that moves the thing along. Um, but for rules, when you look at rules, they to somebody who knows Power Automate or has worked with SharePoint workflow in the past, rules are really simple. But to
Mm.
that point, it also gives me the ability to, within literally a click or two and no training whatsoever, to be able to say, when the status changes to X, send so and so an email, and I'm out. And it really is like writing a sentence versus having to know a separate tool to build out the workflow. But always in balance with, we are also not going to do hugely complex multi-state review and approval type actions. That's a great use for Power Automate. And there's always that balance of, what can we do that doesn't require X, but how can we further integrate when X requirement is required?
That's got to be one of the most requested features in lists, right? Being able to say, right, send a notification email to this person when this changes.
Yep.
And now with the ability to just do that within sort of 5 seconds is a little something so simple, provides a ton of value.
Yeah, and my tiny little example, and it's actually one that I've requested too, just as I've been using more and more. But the one rule that I really want us to build, and the team is hearing it and aware of it beyond me, so it is something that we are working on. But I want to build a rule that says, I know I have some date set on some row item. So for me, it's an example of a session that I have said, yes, I'm going to present at X conference. And I get to set the parameter 7 days before that. Remind me so that I can start
Yeah.
building on my deck and demo and whatever. But to be able to build that today is either you have to use the reminder as we have it, which has a few limitations, or I have to know how to go in and build that flow in Power Automate, or leverage one that's already pre-built and configure it appropriately. But it's just one of those that fits the mold. I've got a date column, and I just want a simple reminder X days before that date. And so within rules, that's a great use case for us to build on, to add new capabilities to rules, but to not go overboard with what you would really go and do in Power Automate for something that's got more complexity.
Yeah. Now, being product manager, I'm assuming you, by nature of the role, have to use lists. So,
Mm.
how many lists realistically have you got, and are you working with day in and day out?
Yeah, it's not as big as you think as far as the actual real, list besides demos. I've got lots for demos and lots of things so that I can showcase and highlight. But for each event that I manage on behalf of the team, just as our event lead, and that's not a sole role, that's a lot of people at Microsoft. I happen to use lists for that, and I think it's easy to share the entire list with stakeholders and reach out to my speakers and ask them for their descriptions, and they put it there, and then I have it, that kind of thing. Um, I do probably about 5 to 10 events, so that kind of list I have times 5 or 10. and I just derive the next one off of the last one using the list, create a list with the list. Um, I also manage, number of features for lists, for SharePoint administration and SharePoint migration, and what we do with Teams. So those are all in one list that I'm managing roadmap features. And so that's working with engineering and then a handoff to our roadmap team. One list that's really cool that I've talked about before, but just to answer your question, as a contributor, so I didn't start this list, and it's got some rigor behind it. So they did hire a team to build out a bit more of a robust list. But it is, before anything goes public on the public roadmap, there is a pretty significant list at Microsoft, at least for Microsoft 365, where all roadmap items, and that's true for Exchange, Yammer, Stream, Teams, lists, SharePoint, whatever, anything that goes in and is going to appear on the public roadmap goes through the queue of submitting onto this list. And as an owner, then I get followed up with approving which SKU is it going to be in, what country availability, and obviously the dates that we work towards for targeted release. So that's a pretty big one. And then there are probably about 2 or 3 others that I just manage that are my personal list that just help me keep organized. And a few that I started as a personal list that I then shared with either a vendor or another team member, but still pretty small use case, but super helpful because it's just right there. If it's a part of a team, I can add it in Teams and have a conversation with that team directly, like you were talking about, app mentioning
Yeah.
somebody, and they'd be able to access the list item directly. So I'm probably not in the significant, because I'm the product manager, it's not like I use lists for everything, but I do use it a lot. And I do try to promote that other people learn how to do it. And that's my other internal evangelization is I get to, help people get their first list started, which is always kind of fun. At the same time, it's sometimes surprising, like, wow, still there are
Yeah.
people that don't know about lists or know about them and still think of them as kind of the old style, hard to do.
Yeah, and I think that example of the roadmap there
Mhm.
shows, I guess, the scale of what lists can be used for. I mean, it's not just something that a couple of people would use and collaborate on. It is sort of enterprise level as well in
Yeah,
the uses that it can be used for.
yep, they've built a nice form. They've built a really nice workflow. There's some automated, emails and notifications and buttons that I can click to move things along once it's gotten approved or at least moved to the next phase. But all the while, as you would imagine, the fields of the list, I submitted the title, the description, the PM and PMM owners and dates and whatnot. But then when it goes through, is it available? To go to the public roadmap? Is it approved? Is it in development? Is it rolling out? All those status that
Mm.
you would see. But yeah, if you go to the public roadmap, Microsoft 365 public roadmap, every single feature that's listed, whether it's in development or launched, and everything in between, is managed on this giant list internally.
Yeah, cool. Now, you mentioned earlier before about different ways that lists can be accessed or entry points.
Mhm.
Do you what are the common entry points that you see others using? Are they using the lists? Do I call it the homepage,
Mhm.
or is it through Microsoft Teams, or even just through SharePoint?
Yeah,
There's obviously different ways to enter
yeah. I'll
lists.
I'll share the four, and there's a fifth one coming that we just are starting to talk about. But they are all the same. They are just an entry point of either where do you start your day, where is it easiest? Because if you're working with more than one list, there's kind of a great place to go to navigate from list to list. But the five, and I'll start with the four that are in market. We've got, of course, SharePoint. There's a new
Yeah.
create experience in SharePoint, but to anybody that doesn't know, still the full back end to where the list actually gets created is SharePoint. But when you're in SharePoint and you click new list, you get this great new experience. And of course, it creates it in that team site or communication site that you're in. So SharePoint's one of them. The next one, which is kind of starting with the new with Microsoft Lists, is what we call Microsoft Lists Home. So if you go to Microsoft 365 or Office 365, the entry point, you sign in and you see the app launcher, you'll see the lists application that then when you go to it, you'll see your favorited lists, your recent lists, and of course the ability to create a new list. So that's kind of entry point number two. The entry point number 3 is also very new and probably where we see the most growth for what is an obvious reason once you hear it, is you can now create and bring in existing lists from within inside Microsoft Teams. And similar to how you see other apps when you add a tab in a channel, you can use the Lists app, and that's gotten a lot of growth recently, not just because Teams growth, but with lists in Teams, it's kind of starts to resonate with what people really want to do with information is track it, organize it, but also work together. So the Lists app makes it easy to create new lists, or if you've got lists, and some of them could have been in SharePoint for 5 years, and once you connect it to Teams, you can then add those old lists, even if you treat them still as new existing lists, as a tab, or you can create from scratch new. The fourth new one, which is now kind of half done, and I say half done because I'm of the other half that hasn't yet fully gotten the benefit, but we started rolling out the new iOS app. So there's a
Yep.
Lists app for iOS. It's hugely functional in the sense of pretty much anything you can do from the web with lists, to create, to edit, to share, to collaborate, of course, to do a lot of what we talked around with rules and templates we haven't talked about yet. You can do that through the mobile app. And the other half that I was joking about is we haven't yet delivered for Android, but that's coming later this year. So
You're
you've
one of
got
those.
this.
You're one of those people.
I know, but I switched a long time ago once Windows Mobile, kind of reared its head out of the grave and said, I'm done. And instead of switching to iPhone, I went Android, and I've been on a Google Pixel 3 XL for a couple of years now, and I still love it. And I just can't wait till the List app comes, because as much as I use List, there are a lot of times where I'd love to just glance at my list and access it just straight from an app. So
Yeah.
that's pretty new. And just I'll be real quick on the last one that I'll save the details from when we actually release it. But the same as you would access files for OneDrive in OneDrive, you can also do that now to create new from Office.com. So if you type in Office.com, that landing spot that's got your kind of
Yeah.
recommended content and a whole bunch of things now, there will be a new entry point there to create a list. And that's something that we're working on.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, the mobile app is the user experience on that on the mobile app is fantastic, and there's so many different use cases there for field workers
Yeah.
or people like that, frontline workers that and that experience is really nice on the
Yeah,
mone device as well.
the team took the approach of being not just a companion, but to be an equal. Like, where do you
Yeah,
start? Are you on your mobile or web? Great. Don't think you can't do something because of a smaller device. I think the other
yeah,
lens they took was same as we were talking about before. There's this continuum of what are you trying to accomplish, and if you throw mobile in there, you have less of a need to build a Power Apps mobile app. And again, not
yeah,
a ding to Power Apps, because there's tons of scenarios where that makes sense. But if you've got a simple use case where you're on the floor at a convention and just collecting information about a client or a number of clients over the course of a couple of days, to be able to create a list on your phone or on the web, but then do that, talking, fill out a couple drop downs, type in a little bit of their response, and then save it. It almost gives you the app side of building an application without having to build the application.
yeah, absolutely. Um, Now, I wanted to shift gears a little bit here and
Mm-hmm.
talk. You are a SharePoint person at heart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, um, obviously, with the current state of the pandemic and everything like that, we've seen a really big increase in the usage of Microsoft Teams, as you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're talking about Teams and SharePoint, and traditionally, SharePoint, we're thinking of intranets and portals and gateways and landing pages and things like that from a company perspective. Where where do you see Teams and SharePoint fitting into that landscape? So, are you still seeing the need and the want and the requirements around companies and organizations having a company intranet and portal, or are things now moving into Teams more than SharePoint, do you think?
So my honest answer is going to sound a little coy, but I would say yes to both. Only
Yeah,
because the state of the world today is yes, a lot of people are using Teams, and a lot of people use Teams for more than one thing by nature of the product itself and everything that's integrated with it. And of course, there's a ton more coming. But we know a lot of our customers have historically built, if they're leveraging SharePoint for their portal or have in the past, and we are too at Microsoft, we have had what we call the Microsoft Web, which for
yeah,
the company portal is the main thing I sign into, but it's got a ton of subportals and sites, everything that really equate to our broader information intranet. Um, Moving that into Teams is something that we've just announced, but has been possible for a while. And
yeah.
we've seen people with or without what is called Microsoft Viva connections, which
Hmm.
at its simplest state means if you've built out a company portal, technically a SharePoint home site, and you want that to come closer to where people are spending a lot of their time, which is in Teams, same as we might have said that in the past, Outlook, you can now have it as a first run experience, a really nice integration without people having to jump between two apps. But the content and the content management of that content, and of course the a lot of components underneath that with how the pages are laid out, where the information is stored, who gets to see what, and how it's permissioned. That is, of course, the heavy lifting that SharePoint is still doing. But the end user experience, if you go through the connections route, is Teams. And
Mm,
if it is SharePoint that you're clicking on as you go from navigation element to navigation element, if it's SharePoint, it'll just kind of stay within Teams. If it's something that is a third party system or a form you need to fill out or a something other, you might break out of Teams. Um, but there's that portal element is still a you would build it in SharePoint
yeah,
if you kind of are that person building and designing or owning those pages. But for the majority of end users, at least in this new modern work era of Viva, you may have as an entry point into SharePoint and not to stop there, but to be, at least from a portal perspective, it could be Teams.
mm,
I think that being said, though, we've already talked about one thing that SharePoint contributes to Teams, which is lists. So the Teams team would really don't want to, and they shouldn't build the database product
yeah,
outside of their conversations with it, which is a special build in Azure. Um, but for lists, we already have a great mechanism to store, to protect them, and of course, all the functionality is there. So the focus is just make it a great user experience in Teams. And so that's true for lists, for document libraries and documents themselves, and for pages. So I think first out of the gate, beyond the big work that you see with Viva Connections, is this I want to create, share, and stay within Teams. And I think that pattern will be how you think about Teams and SharePoint working together. We know SharePoint is now over 20 years old, and that doesn't mean it's legacy and outdated. That just means it's got a lot of stuff that we've been building over time, and in the last 5 years have been modernizing the entire platform, primarily a lot of the end user experience, but more than that. And now lists have gotten kind of this double down, make a product out of it. And all of that coming through Teams is something you can do from the get-go in Teams, if not to bring forward into Teams.
yeah,
And I think there's that improvement you're starting to see with SharePoint pages now being able to at least edit the page
yeah,
in Teams. And with documents, we really have been working on that parity for a long time, and I think have made a lot of progress so that a document library, but working with documents, is something that you can do natively and feel comfortable about the elements of the document, but also the document itself with how we integrate with the Office for the web that now, of course, also is integrated with the Teams experience.
yeah.
So,
It's interesting with Teams. I mean, obviously, people. I guess traditionally, people's first entry point or first use into Office 365, let's say, might have been with SharePoint or with
mhm,
OneDrive. But
mhm,
over the last sort of 12, 18 months, their first entry point has been Teams. And now, what I'm seeing is, and hearing from others as well, is that it's almost been an about face. So that they've been using
mhm,
Teams for meetings and chat, and now they're starting to think about what else can we use? What else can we do now? And
Yep.
then now SharePoint is now coming almost not full circle, but it's now coming back into focus as well.
Yeah, I think for a long time, if you look at some of the pre Microsoft Teams, some of the applications that were spawned off of SharePoint
Yeah.
uh, were things like Office 365 Video that became Microsoft Stream. Yammer to some degree leverages SharePoint a lot. And there were just a number of other services or features that just leveraged SharePoint. Or
Mm.
like Stream, even though it's now coming back a little bit 180, a lot of those components that SharePoint didn't have, we leveraged from the Azure platform. And a
Yeah.
lot of that with video was the Azure Media Services. So if you look at that pattern of SharePoint knew that there were a lot of capabilities within Azure that we could take advantage of to build a new, what a lot of people were doing with SharePoint to build an enterprise video portal. And we wanted to carve that out so that you don't have to build that, you just use it. And so that evolved into Stream, and that's a good thing. Where Stream, if you didn't know, for a long time and now even more so, almost 100% is built on SharePoint. And I think through that same pattern, you can see a lot of how the Teams product is evolving. And granted, it's more than SharePoint that's contributing to that. But if the Teams team were to recreate everything from scratch to accomplish what a lot of other products have already been doing, you would see us way behind schedule, and we would not be able to have offered a lot of the rich functionality, especially when it comes to content. Because we really do, we being the collective Microsoft engineering teams, they leverage SharePoint as the content service for Teams. That
Yeah.
being said, everything that's chat and meeting related, and a lot of the core value beyond content is not SharePoint. Um,
Yeah.
and the goodness, I think, that comes through, which might open up the question of, well, what's happening to SharePoint, or where's it going? The reality is it's being leveraged, and the actual end user usage of it is through the roof, bigger than it's ever been. But the front door is different. The way that we track it is, of course, Teams and Teams growth, but leveraging SharePoint where content is stored, those numbers are only going up. And I don't
Mm.
mean that from a metrics like woohoo. It's just, but the reality of both products are maturing. It just happens to be that the abstract nature of SharePoint in Teams hopefully feels more like a Teams feature versus I'm going to SharePoint.
Yeah. Um, do you see? Do you have any insight into? I guess where where the usage and the adoption of Teams really is. I mean, I hear a lot about everybody's in Teams and that type of thing. Do you think that's actually reality? So we look at all the stats and the metrics and daily usage and things like that. Where do you see? I guess the adoption of Teams. Are people actually starting their day in Teams? Is that
Mhm.
reality?
I can't say holistically. Obviously, every customer and every user is going to be a little bit
Mm,
different. And to be honest, I still split my time between Outlook and Teams. When I turn to Teams, it's a little bit more of a richer platform for,
yeah.
if I have a chat thread, there's oftentimes content related to it. And it's either one piece of content or multiple tabs that just equate to a team that works together more often. So I see, at least from what I have visibility on, and I know the numbers that publicly, Teams is skyrocketing,
Mm,
from a use perspective, and a lot of that is video calling for how we are all
yeah.
connecting by need in terms of the pandemic. But I think also just getting more comfortable. If there's any part of digital transformation, which just means the inclusivity of others that aren't in the same room, it used to be a bit of an afterthought. And to be honest, if you were on the other end where you were the one calling in, it wasn't as well of a connected experience, especially when it came to somebody dropping in content, sharing a screen,
Mm,
you sharing to them, whatever that might be. But the where I see it really being reality to your question is for those continuing conversations, and I've got a number of different work groups. I bet like everybody else. One of them is this new team that we have that supports Viva, is pretty spread out between a number of different teams, engineering and marketing. And we've got 3 or 4 active areas where we've got our marketing, we've got our events, we've got our, planning, and then the kind of the what comes next for, Viva in the future. And all of those are ongoing discussions. And to be frank, they would be terrible email threads.
Mm.
They would not be appropriate for how you'd want to track and manage that somehow only in SharePoint. And to be frank, some of the ways that you have to still search to find something that might have been 3 weeks ago, but it is there and it's usually connected, and it's usually, when you put a piece of content, you more often than not, you don't move things anymore
Yeah.
because you just have a link or you have a tab or you've got, something that somebody referenced in a meeting that was recorded and now that's linked as well, and you can easily search through a meeting. So
Yeah.
there's a lot for ongoing work that I think really is, for me, served in Teams. But when I work with external vendors or I work with, some of the event teams, you and I coordinated through email to then get this set up. There's obviously, use for a multitude of different communication styles and
Yeah.
tools.
That's right.
But I do see Teams with a little bit of a learning curve if you really want to go beyond chat and meetings. It really does support a better collaborative experience versus an email attachment. Even if you do it right as a link, still has its limitations to be inclusive of anybody that
Yeah.
joins that from the get-go or 3 weeks later.
Yeah, I still see. I keep saying that SharePoint is. There was comments along or a number of years ago now about SharePoint being dead and all that sort of
Mm,
stuff, and I kind of see SharePoint going to take off again in terms of where you mentioned Viva before, so
mhm.
Viva Connections
Yep.
and those organisations that did enter the Office 365 ecosystem, I guess, with Teams and with
Mhm.
meetings and chat. Now, when they might look at a corporate communications platform and using connections,
Mhm.
I think the introduction of that is going to mean SharePoint is going to be front and center again, and organizations looking at how they can leverage that a lot more as well, I think.
We hope so. That is the way that it's being designed, and it's not
Mm,
it's not outside of Teams. It's in
no,
conjunction
yep.
with Teams. A lot of what the Microsoft Viva, as one new example, the entry point is Teams for all of Viva, but the real backbone, and specifically when people ask like, what is the investment that I need to
Mm,
make to stand up Viva, if you are starting to unpeel what it is. The two that obviously are really close to SharePoint are topics and connections.
yeah.
Topics just being a really smart lens through to the content, but keeping you where you're at. So it's, highlighting topics of interest and then taking you through a journey to learn more about that topic. And in addition to that, people and content. Um, all of that is SharePoint based,
Yeah.
but it's visualized either through a Teams chat or even directly on a SharePoint page, or in the future in an email. Those topics will start popping up like highlights that you would see on a web page for an acronym you don't know or a project name that you've not heard
Mm.
of before.
And,
Um,
and dare I say, the employee experience there, and
mm,
not a user not having to break their flow of work. So
yep,
if you're in Teams or you're in SharePoint or you're in Yammer or wherever, then you're going to have that similar experience across different platforms or across different
yeah,
services.
yeah. I think so, and I think it. Whether you're talking about cross-platform or cross-device or to the end user, where are you today?
Mm,
It could be,
yeah,
we've talked about Outlook and Teams. That might be where you spend some of your time, but you might also just be working in Office, or you might be
yeah,
working, through a SharePoint team site, or, and I don't mean to say low level, high level, but anywhere you are is available to plumb through more contextual information.
mm,
And there is always going to be the intranet and the portal, maybe more for mid to enterprise size customers that have invested or see the benefit of that type of knowledge and information access and engagement. And where Viva, I think, lends in and at least shines a new example of the benefits that you get when you invest a core platform that can then house a lot of content, a lot of access, and be different for all of different teams. So there's also that pivot of audience targeting.
Yeah.
I have a front door that everybody can walk through, but imagine if the room was made up of all different furniture, depending on whether you walk in the door or I walk in the door. And
Mm.
I mean that from a comfort perspective. Like, yes, those are my people. That is the information that I know. Or I go into a different room because I'm looking for different people, different content. Um, Bubbling that up, making it easier through Teams or through a new app experience or the on hover experiences that, like you had said, brings the information to you. You still have the need at some level. It could be 10% of the organization that's actually creating the content, managing the content, archiving the content, making sure that the new information is out there and the old information isn't found. That can be challenging, at a scale and over time. But when you get the relevancy, the thing that we haven't yet talked about that I think is kind of the last glue mile of, well, if you didn't have SharePoint in there, then your experience is really
Mm.
terrible. But SharePoint really gave birth to the Microsoft Graph. And
Yeah.
even though it is managed and certainly the complexities of it live beyond SharePoint, there is that notion of it's connected to the search index, it's connected to people activities, it's connected to, a lot of things are managed through the graph. And a lot of these new experiences build off of that so that it's relevant, personal, but without a lot of that work that was already available in SharePoint to make that a relevant, personalized experience, now has more signals and provides more from these different surface areas.
Yes, it does indeed. Now, Mark, I could talk with you about this for a very long time. We will wrap things up there.
Okay.
We might continue this in another episode as well. But I really appreciate you coming on and having a discussion about not only lists but also SharePoint, Teams, Viva, and all of those topics as well. Now, as we wrap up, you do host your own podcast as well, and you are very out there in the community, posting a lot of content and sharing a lot of stuff. Where can people find you if they want to listen in or read your content?
Yeah, I've got three places. I'll try to make it simple. The podcast is called The Interzone. And if you go and check it out at aka.ms/the interzone, you'll find a show about the Microsoft 365 intelligent internet, as we've set the tagline. And our intent is to be engaging, talk with people internally and external to Microsoft to get a behind the scenes look or an advanced look or a very timely look at product announcements, product usage, and all the things that we think resonate with how people should at least be aware of if you're invested in this space, what it is that you have at your fingertips. And I'll take a moment here to just congratulate you on starting a new podcast. I know it from a couple of years ago. It's a little bit of heavy lifting. Once you land on a name and a description, then there's the real details of getting the show started and scheduling and all that stuff. So I think you have a fun road ahead of you with this new podcast. So
Well,
congratulations.
I've got Microsoft Lists to help me plan and everything like that.
There you
So
go. That's actually reminds me to your earlier question. I too have a list of all the episodes that we have had and the ones that we are planning. So perfect use of a content oriented list.
very good.
Um,
I'll pop pop all of these links also in the show notes.
That's
So
great. So the other two are just I write for anything that's Microsoft that I manage as a product manager, sometimes working with my engineering peers to publish to the SharePoint tech community the Microsoft tech community, the SharePoint blog.
yep.
And you can go to aka.ms/blog, or sorry, aka.ms/SharePoint/blog. And that'll land you into everything that we've been announcing. And certainly when it comes time around Ignite, that's where we disclose everything. And then the last one is similar, but it's a little bit more through just me. I started a new Substack called Cashbox.
You
And if you go
did.
to cashbox.substack.com, you'll find things that I'm mostly writing about some of the same things, but just my personal experiences or just a different take that not about a feature release, but more around use and adoption. So
Yeah,
trying
I
to have
love
fun
that.
there.
That's really good. So for everybody listening, that the cache box, as I call it, as you call it. Having those really use case based, how you use lists or how you use
Yep.
to do is really gives you a really good insight into different ways that you can use each of the products as well. That's
Yeah,
really good.
I
Yeah.
try to give it a lens of, here's my experience. Obviously, I weight it with a little bit about here's what, other people have
Yeah.
written, or here's what's out there that just resonates, and put a little new context to it. And on that, I try to publish every Friday. I've been pretty on schedule now, but again, it augments, some of the things that we just wouldn't say, from a feature release perspective. It's more that
Yeah.
use perspective.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Once again, thank you very much, Mark. And we'll have to have you back on in a future episode to continue these conversations.
That sounds great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Daniel. And again, good luck on the new podcast.
Thank you.